This is Jack at Stony Knolls Farm. It's a great May morning. Here we are giving you some basic tips for gardening. I'm over at James and Ashley, the neighbors, and kind of getting them lined up. Last year, we laid this garden out, and if you'll notice, we took care to make sure that it was square with the world. So if you see in the video how these row of onions, which was planted last fall, lines up with the planted rows in the field back there. And we did that last year to make sure that we weren't kittywampus. My dad used that term all the time. Don't want it to be kittywampus. So we lined up the garden so that it's even with the rows, and then we squared it up, meaning we measured from corner to corner to make sure it's the same distance. And if it's the same distance, that means it's square. So we started out with a square garden. We're gonna move on to the next tip, which is spading a garden or making sure that the garden soil is of good tilth. Tip number 2 from Stony Knolls: when you've got some soil in the garden, you've got to make sure that it's loosened up. And the old-fashioned way, before we had mechanical tillers, was to use a garden spade, just like this, 4 tines, like 6 in the ground. And I'm going to show you how they used to do it years ago. So you just stick it in the ground, and you flip it up. And basically, this soil is pretty hard. You can see the chunks. And that's why we're doing this, because you don't want hard soil. Your roots won't penetrate if they got to go through something like this. Not unless it's cactus or something like that. All right, we'll do one more row. Flip it. All right, and then just kind of break those chunks up. Soil that's been conditioned a little better will eventually be easier and easier to spade every year. But you kind of see the importance of making sure you've got that broke up. Tip number 3 for beginning gardeners is row spacing. So remember, we squared the garden up so it's square with the world. And now we're going to make sure that we run a string to make sure the row is straight and square with the world. So we made up these sticks. These sticks happen to be 34 inches wide because that's the width we used last year. My rototiller is pretty wide, so they need more space. However, if you have a smaller rototiller, if you see, we put notches every 6 inches so that you can shorten your row up by 6 inches or 12 inches, depending on what size rototiller you have. James and Ashley have a smaller rototiller, so probably in the future they'll probably make their rows 12 inches shy of 34 inches, okay? So basically, you use that stick as the measurer. Here's row number 1 and row number 2, okay? Pound that stick in the ground. And I'm gonna travel to the other end of the garden and put the stick in. Nice and tight. Make sure it's nice and tight. You can wind it up a little bit on the stick somewhat, and then just pound it in the ground. Okay, and we're gonna show you in our next tip about seeding. And but before that, we want to talk a little bit about compaction. So that'll be tip number 4, keeping your soil from getting compacted. Okay, so we're going to talk about compaction. If you think about, you just spend all your time loosening the soil up, and then when you're getting ready to seed, you walk back and forth through the row. And that's probably not a big deal, other than what you've created here is a perfect environment for weed seeds to germinate. Here it takes them a while. You have to have several rains. The soil has to get a little bit compacted, and the seeds will take maybe a week to 2, maybe even 3 weeks. But if you step on this, you've got a perfect soil conditions for weeds to grow. And by doing this, by preventing compaction while you're seeding, you're going to save yourself a lot of premature work. So what we do is we lay down a board that we can walk on, and in this case we'd have a couple of boards laid out, And so now, basically, I could step on this ground and not make deep footprints and keep those seeds from germinating for a couple of weeks. That way we've got time for the plants to come up. You've got time for a little break in your action. And when the weeds start coming up in the row, well, you're gonna have a tiller. You can go back and forth with the tiller, but no sense doing work unless you have to. All right, tip number 5, we're gonna prepare to plant the seeds. The very first thing you wanna do is mark your rows, what you're planting. And I always put the date on. It's kind of nice to know over time how long it takes for plants to germinate. So mark your rows. If you're only gonna plant a partial row, let's say you only plant 6 feet, mark another marker and label it for the rest of the row, but mark your rows. The next thing is the seed trench. If you're planting a deep seed like a bean seed, they're pretty big and they usually have to be planted about 2 inches deep. And if you don't have the seed depth the same or the trench the same and you put your seeds in, this one's going to be shallow and this one's going to be deeper. This is shallow and deep, so that's not good. What you want to do is make sure you keep your trench the same depth all the way across. Remember, we're going to plant, these seeds are going to be bean seeds, and you want it down about 1 inch. And I usually finish up by just going backward across the entire trench one more time. All right, so then you're going to put your seed at the bottom of the trench, beans about every 3 inches, okay? And then sometimes take your hand like this and just kind of make sure you got the lumps out of the way and it's all the same. Plant your seeds, and then when you cover, you know if it's flat with the soil, it's down 1 inch. And it's important because if it's buried deeper, it's going to come up later. If it's buried too shallow, it's not going to have a very good root system. So depth of seed is important. Follow the directions on the label. Okay, so when you're planting a really small seed like lettuce or carrots, they only need to be down 1/8 inch. So I usually take a stick. Now here's a hoe handle, and I just make a little rounding in there, just like this. See that? And it's not very deep. And I come along and I sprinkle my carrot seed or lettuce seed in there and just shove it back just a little bit, just like that. Just covering up. Now, it's kind of lumpy there. It's not a really good seed surface. So I always take my rake and I just tamp it down just a little bit, just like that. And then by the time you water it in with a little sprinkling can, it'll be nice, good soil to seed contact. And by the way, when you're watering for the first time, don't douse it. Use a fine, gentle spray and just kind of, you don't want to dig out the dirt. You just want a nice, fine, gentle spray to wet that soil. All right, yes, so even beginners can square up their garden, get the rows straight, till the dirt, make sure it's soft and fluffy, and get that seed planted at the right depth. This is Jack at Stony Knolls signing off.